No fancy intro this week. We are live with everything you wanted to hear about wargaming, but we're afraid to ask. I am Ardwulf, and with me is Dancing Dan, Matt Pancaldi from No Enemies Here. So I would like to welcome everyone to the stream. Hopefully we are actually live. It looks like we are. We have 13 people watching.
We're live.
So far. So everything is going spectacularly well. Other than this terrible haircut that I got, but I'm gonna go to it.
I think you're mighty handsome.
I'm not happy with it. It looks real stupid. It had like a thing sticking down, like
kind of looked like Squiggy.
A little bit, yeah. I was not particularly happy with that, but otherwise everything's going good. So tonight we are talking about unit scale. What do you think about?
And I'm here to learn, my friend, because I need to learn this scale stuff.
Okay, so we're going to talk about unit scale and why it is a critical decision for game designers to think about, and why it is therefore totally irrelevant.
Uh-oh, we got Stigler.
So Stigler's here. He's going to talk about how Decision Games is doing it wrong, and he's probably right. So unit scale, I mean, it's a thing that we use to describe games, right? If somebody says, "Hey, what's a Time for Trumpets all about?" I'm going to probably respond with, well, it's a battalion level game on the Battle of the Bulge, right?
Right.
Other games I'm going to be less inclined to put up front. If it's a really high scale, like a World in Flames or World at War, or the war that Compass Games is doing, for example, I'm probably not going to throw it's a core scale game or an army scale or whatever. That's because the distinctions tend to mean a little bit less the higher the scale is that you go.
Artie, you said army scale. There is such a thing?
Oh, sure. But again, it gets a little abstract at that level. I mean, WIF is World of Flames uses Soviet units or armies, for example. So yeah, absolutely. But above that, it starts to lose its meaning, really. So if you look at something like the Struggle for Europe that we have flashed multiple times, what is the scale on that? There really isn't one, right? The designer had to think about, hey, what are the numbers involved? How do I want to represent military forces in this game? But it's abstracted out into a set of strength of non-fungible, in the case of that game, strength points.
Now let me ask you something, Artie. When a designer has an idea of what game he's designing, scale is on the forefront.
I think generally speaking that's true, unless it's a really high strategic level game. But there's like map scale and unit scale and time scale, right? So how many, what amount of time does a turn represent? Is it an hour or is it a quarter, right? Or a half a year or something like that? I'm pretty sure there's at least one World War II game floating around where the turns are half a year. You could call, Matt Taylor points out Axis and Allies. What's the scale of that? Nobody knows. It doesn't really matter. They're just little figures.
Wouldn't you say strategic?
It's a little figure scale. Oh, sure, but it's a little figure scale game. I mean, it's a game that abstracts it to the point where it's meaningless to talk about it. In addition, sometimes the scale, the quote unquote scale, doesn't correspond to like a specific military formation size, right? So a lot of games work, well, a fair number of games anyway, work on strength points of some kind, and the strength points probably represent such and such a number of men. And I can think of a lot of games like this, actually. The old Victory game Civil War does this. The point-to-point card-driven games on the Mark Herman model, of which GMT has done a bunch, like the Napoleonic Wars and Here I Stand and stuff like that. Those all have just strength points.
What about Paths of Glory?
Paths of Glory. So the Paths of Glory is an army level game. The units represent armies, and at least the French, German, and Russian units represent armies. And then you have smaller units that are corps, but the backbone of the game is based on armies on most of the map. There's like the Middle Eastern map, you operate with mostly smaller units, but the backbone of the game is based on army. So that's an example of the same type of game, right? It's very similar broadly to a game like the Napoleonic Wars, except that the units are specific military formations, right? They're the German Third Army or the French Fifth Army or whatever they are. There are also games where it's a bit hybridized. So the one I can think of is the old SPI, War Between the States, along with it's second edition from Decision. They're almost exactly the same game, mistakes and all. Where the units are divisions, but they're really strength points, right? You build a division, you could build it to a smaller value if you want, but you could build a division at up to 10 points. It's a 10-point division when you bring it out. And as it takes losses, it takes a loss, it goes down to a 9-point division. It takes another loss, it goes down to an 8-point division. It goes down to 2 points and it becomes a brigade, but who cares? It doesn't really matter.
I have a question.
Sure.
Now, when you're talking about unit scale, does map scale come into consideration with the unit scale?
It better. If it doesn't, you probably are going to have problems with the design. There are examples of that. I think the most obvious example for me is the one I've talked about a lot, which is Europa, where it's got this very high granularity unit scale, where there's a lot of units. But the map scale's, not that big, because it was originally designed with the East Front of World War II in mind. So you kind of could only get so big, right? So, but then when they decided to fill out the rest of the war, they had to stick with the same unit scale or map scale, but they stuck with the same unit scale too, and it works a lot less well on the West Front in particular. Works better in areas of World War II where there is less stuff, like down in the Balkans or in North Africa or something like that. In the West Front, it's massively congested, even worse than it is on the East Front.
And the scale change in the same game?
No, it did not. But there's examples of that too. So, for example, in OCS, the East Front scale is 5 miles to the hex. Okay. The West Front scale is 3.5 miles to the hex. And some of the older games on the West Front or in the Med are 2.5 miles to the hex. Otherwise, the rules are absolutely, they changed the ranges on the aircraft. Otherwise, the rules are absolutely identical. There are no differences.
Within the same game I'm talking about.
Within the same game, there are at least a couple examples of games with telescoping scale, like I hate to bring this up because I'm kind of tired of talking about it, but the Decision Games version of War in the Pacific has so you got the big Pacific map. You got 7 huge maps that are the whole Pacific, and then you have an island map for each island, whether that island was historically fought over or not. So, but those islands are of vastly different sizes, right? There's little tiny rocks, and there's giant islands like places like Okinawa or Guadalcanal. It's a fairly big island. So you have different unit scales. So you need this kind of different map scale. So you need this kind of telescoping unit scale too, where you can kind of break your divisions down into brigades or regiments, and then you break the regiments down into battalions, and then you break the battalions down into companies, or to whatever degree it actually works. I suspect it stops at the battalion level, but still. But that creates a lot of headache and overhead. You're looking at a whole set of mechanisms just to deal with that if you have that kind of telescoping scale. There is a new game called Empire at Sunset or something like that from Hollandsfield.
Yeah, Strelnikov here is talking about it.
Empire, there you go. Strelnikov, Empire at Sunset. Yeah, but that looks really clean. I'm very curious to see that actually, because it is a World War I in the Pacific, which first of all is a topic we don't see a lot about, and by we don't see a lot about it, I'm unaware of any other game on the subject. There are a few games like Storm of Steel and I think Balance of Powers might have some abstracted Pacific stuff going on, but it's not really.
Storm of Steel video game?
Storm of Steel, the game, the World War I game from Decision Games by Joe Miranda.
Oh.
So Storm of Steel is also used for one of the Academy Games. Was it Academy Games?
Yes.
Products. Yeah. And I think it's been used in a couple of places, including, I think, in video games. Jeff mentions that Europa works best on the East Front of war divisions and core and lots of reinforcement, worse in the Western Desert. Well, yeah, but the actual practical unit scale is a lot of battalions and regiments. So I don't really mind that. Whether you like the Western Desert game or not, I think the scale bothers me less in the Western Desert than it does on the West Front. East Front is a little different, but the games there's also multiple versions of the game in the East, and therefore those games might behave a little bit differently, right? So I mean, there's less units. There's like several hundred less counters in Dragonok Austin than there are in Fire in the East, for example.
Artie, can you answer? Yes, sir.
Should map scale drive map size, or should map size constrain game scale, given that 22 by 34 seems to be an industry standard? Well, there's plenty of it. That's true. That is pretty much the industry standard, at least for American publishers. But there's nothing holding people to that. I mean, you can have games at different sizes, and even as big a publisher as GMT has games with maps of different sizes than 22 by 34. Space Empires 4X, for example, has a slightly smaller map than that, and they've got a couple other ones like that. There's at least a couple games. The board for Defending America from Compass is 11 by 17, for example. So I suspect that 22 by 34 footprint is less a guide for designers than it is maybe a cap for that some designers decide maybe they don't want to get bigger than that. But I don't think the size itself constrains anything. Should map scale drive map size? Yeah, I would think so. I mean, your map scale has there's some correlation, right? There's some correlation between your map scale and your unit scale. So your unit scale determines to some extent, I mean, it should, right? One should inform the other. So you end up with, if you decide, hey, I want to do the bulge at the battalion level, well, you're going to end up with a big map, right? That's just the way it is. If you decide you're going to do it at the regimental level, then you have something like Ardennes 40. So the contrast, the 5 map time for trumpets, you could probably squeeze it into 4. Most bulge games at that scale are 4. Versus
at the battalion level,
yeah. But then you look at Ardennes 44, which is the Mark Simonich game, which is a fabulous game, by the way. That's a regimental game, and that's 2 maps. So, and of course, Bitter Woods is, I think, also regimental. Now that I think about it, and it's 2 maps in the Compass version, I believe. But I believe it was 1 map in the Avalon Hill version.
Did you like that
I could be wrong about that. I've never played Bitter Woods, so I owned it at one point, but I have never played it.
That's Randy Heller, right?
Yes, it is. Battlefleet Mars, Doug mentions. Battlefleet Mars uses that's true, but that's there's several ways in which that's an oddball game. Even more oddball is the John Carter of Mars game that not only was released by SPI, but was designed by the then youngster Mark Herman. So, which I'm not sure I've ever owned that. I don't think so. But then the cover seems so familiar. But the cover's it's got like a Frank Frazetta cover.
Yeah, it's a Conan thing.
Yeah, but it's John Carter. Frank Frazetta did Burroughs as well. So, I'd really kind of like to take a look at that game, to be honest about it. It doesn't necessarily. I don't know if it's any good, but it looks very interesting.
Is it expensive? Is it expensive?
It's reasonably. Yeah, I think it was only released in a box as a bookcase box, and games that were only released in bookcase boxes tend to be at least a little bit pricey. I have not priced it out.
The Dark Sands has different map scales.
I don't think that's true. I could be mistaken about that. I don't have the Dark Sands and haven't played it. I've only played the Dark Valley. Let me get to that in a second. Jeff says he likes a scale that does not require cookie cutter units. I actually also, generally speaking, prefer to not have cookie cutter units where like all American regiments have these 3 factors on them.
I see.
Where they're all the same. I think that reflects, generally speaking, either some kind of scale abstraction or it represents a lack of research on the part of the designer. And in many cases, it's like, it feels like, hey, this designer did a bunch of research just to do the order of battle in the first place, which looks correct. Why have all the units be all the same? That doesn't make any sense.
No.
So, yeah, I mean, some of these U.S. units in the Normandy campaign in particular have vastly different levels of performance, right? So I did not. Now, let me circle back to the Dark Sands here. And we're talking more about map scale than unit scale, but I guess that's fine. I didn't think this was the case. What I thought was the case was that the Dark Sands had separated map areas for the different parts of where the fighting took place in the desert campaign. They might be at different scales too, In which case, I'd be curious to see how that works.
How many counters is in that game if it's different
Not
scales,
that many.
man?
Not that many. It's like a counter sheet and a half or 2 counter sheets or something like
Well,
that.
and
It's not that.
You can use the same counters on the different map scales?
I don't know that it had, like I said, I don't have the game, but I don't know that it looked like it had 2 separate counter mixes in it. So that's why I say that doesn't sound quite right to me, but he could be right. Like I said, I haven't played it or really even looked at it that closely. Strelnikov mentions the John Carter movie. I liked it too, for what it's worth, except for Tyler, whatever his name was. It was John Carter. I didn't really like him very much. Everybody else was great. And it looked good. So, but it was, it didn't do that poorly, but it didn't do well enough for Disney to want to throw another $300 million at it. What?
Yeah. Oh,
holy cow. Yeah. See, I have not looked at that, and I'm definitely not paying $325.
Yeah.
Under no circumstances do I think that is a fair price.
Where's it sold for $325?
I assume this is either I don't know, maybe it's eBay. I mean, you got crazy people selling stuff on eBay, but eBay is not a place where war games are typically sold for auction anymore. A lot of times they're sold by stores who are just put it up at whatever price, and they can afford to let it sit there for a year and a half till somebody says, the hell with it, I want it bad enough, I'll pay $325.
That's right.
So whether that's a fair, that seems way too high to me, but what do I know? I mean, like I said, I have not researched it. I agree with Stigler. I wouldn't pay that for War of the Ring either, the SPI War of the Ring, which is definitely an interesting game. And that is a Richard Berg and Howard Barish, I think, were the designers on that. I'm sure about Berg. I'm not sure about the other designer.
I know there was Carl Paradzi who lent me that game. He lent me like 10, 15 games in a shot, but he specifically said, be careful with that one, please.
Yeah. So this is an interesting point that Doug mentions. Freedom in the Galaxy, which of course is right up here. Remember what it's actually even more extreme than Doug is suggesting here. So what Doug is saying is that there's fleet battles with Death Star or atrocity units, I think they're called in the game, and also characters. And this is kind of a function of the two sides are extremely asymmetric in that game. On the one hand, you have the rebels who do a lot of character level stuff, although they have fleets and fighters and stuff like that. And the Empire, who has some characters, but mostly they're moving fleets around looking for the secret rebel base. So, I mean, it's what you'd think it is based on when it came out. That's a BGG market price. Well, I don't know. BGG market prices are not always reasonable either. Although I generally that's where I start checking prices is on BGG rather than eBay. So, but that doesn't mean everybody selling on BGG is not a lunatic either. So, Chris Ridley check out Chris's blog too. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, in the video description for the next Monday stream. If he's got a really nice blog about books as they relate to war games, and it's actually a super valuable resource.
I'm going to check it out.
It's his blog, so we'll get the link up at some point. Please. I don't have it in front of me right now. So, but anyway, 38 people watching. That's cool. So I don't know if there's any other Mark Herman games. So there's an extra variable here that you may or may not be considering when you ask this question, in that a lot of Mark Herman games are still in print because they have, in many cases, sometimes there are ancient games that just came back in the last couple of years because that's the thing that's happening now.
That's right.
But I mean, we're getting a new version of Pacific War that was going for $150 at some point. France 1944 came back, and the Peloponnesian War came back, and so a bunch of Mark's old designs are once again either in circulation or about to be. So that is an extra variable in the math for that particular question.
So Dune, the Dune game, the old one, the first
the Avalon. Well, yeah, I believe Avalon Hill was the original publisher of that.
So how much is that going for now?
It was going for a couple $100. It is going for way less now because a new edition of it is out from Dream. Gale Force 9. I want to say Dream
That's right.
9, which is a defunct RPG publisher, I believe. Pacific War games at the strategic level are hard to do. Victory in the Pacific versus Pacific War say, well, I agree with the statement, but Pacific War is not really a strategic game. Empire of the Sun is, but then again, you look at the comparison between Victory in the Pacific and Empire of the Sun, and they're vastly different games. And they're both great games, actually. I'm going to fall on the side of Empire of the Sun personally, but
that's a CDG one, right?
Empire of the Sun is a card-driven game, yes. Victory in the Pacific is an old Avalon Hill game that I think originally was published by somebody else. It's a very good game, very influential game at that, and it's area movement with a pretty high unit scale where counters represent groups of ships rather than individual ships, which is the case in Empire of the Sun too. So you've got a counter with the Enterprise on it that represents the Enterprise and another carrier as well. So when one of them gets sunk, that's when you flip the counter over and it's at its reduced strength side. So unfortunately, there's some licensing constraints on that I think make that super duper unlikely. There is a John Carter RPG floating around now from Modifius Entertainment, and it's actually very good. I like it.
But Mark was pretty smart about his publishing rights or whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe it's easy to do that when you run the company, right. But I don't know that Mark had any say. I mean, maybe I don't know, but there's the Burroughs estate to be concerned about, right? Presumably, SPI got a license from the Burroughs estate to do a John Carter game, and then they paid Frank Frazetta some money to get the cover art, which is a great piece of cover art, by the way. So that for those who don't know, the version of Dune that Gale Force 9 has done, then the current one is the same game as the Avalon Hill game. There's not any real difference. They kind of separated it into basic and advanced rules, but the original game might have done that too. It's a fabulous game, not a war game, but I think this is true only for the big fleet carriers, though, and maybe the big battleships as well. So I could be wrong. It's been a few years since I did, several years since I played Victory in the Pacific. Let me put it that way. So it does sound like I'm incorrect about that, but that is the case where the counters represent multiple ships in Empire of the Sun. That I can tell you. So it is a long sitting, though. I feel like that's the thing I don't like about Victory in the Pacific is that it feels like it takes longer than it should based on the kind of game that it is, and that is the thing that I feel about a lot of Avalon Hill games. Actually, like they take longer than they should based on the kind of games that they are.
Kilroy was here. Hey, Kilroy, what's up, man? Robert.
There he is. Yes. So yeah. The FFG game Rex is essentially Dune. There are some differences, though. It's not a completely straight adaptation. In the Twilight Imperium universe, with completely different, branding and flavor text and all that. So because they loved the game, because it really is a cool game.
Yeah, but what does Kilroy was here know about IP address, IP whatever?
Isn't he like an IP lawyer or something like that? So this is true. But the Avalon Hill one, they did I'm trying to picture that in my head, because there was actually a Dune board game that was done, I believe, by Parker Brothers as well, and that definitely had Sting on the cover. But that's a completely different game. That was like a family board game type of thing that I'm sure no families ever played, or at least more than once. Where the Avalon Hill Dune was a game that had an enduring legacy. People thought it was a great game, and that's why the French publisher, whoever that was, kept it in print for many years after Avalon Hill stopped selling it. And FFG redid it as Rex, more or less, and why Gale Force 9 grabbed it and basically redid the same game with new art. So,
do you know if they had to pay a hefty sum to get that license?
I would assume that they did, yeah.
Man,
but I mean, I don't know. Don't ask me.
they got it before the movie came out, so imagine
Well,
if they got it after.
The movie was supposed to be out like 2 years ago, so something like that. It's a movie I'm looking forward to seeing. I just really kind of wish they would come out with it already.
Don't forget it's Canadian, huh? Canadian.
Well, that's true.
Damn right, that's true. He's from Montreal.
I don't think that has anything to do with the movie's lateness, though. I'm just saying. So, because the cast were all well fed, because he's from Quebec, presumably. So I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. 45 people watching right now. So I've had an exhausting day. I wrote like 5,000 words of documentation and cross-checked it and images and all that stuff.
But you had enough time to get a haircut.
Very tiring. I got the haircut over the weekend, actually.
Wow.
I was like, oh, I don't want to do it. And then I was like, I need to do it. So I'm going to go do it. So Charles Latour, thanks for stopping by. John Longshore as well. So thanks to everybody for stopping by. So unit scale. Not sure I have anything else to add unless anybody has questions.
Well, I do.
Okay, what's the question?
Can you start from tactical and go up again, please?
Well, and I've said this before. I feel like whether a game is like the game scale is tactical, strategic, operational. The way I list it in my database, because I'm a dork, is either tactical, operational, strategic, or abstract. Something like Freedom in the Galaxy would be considered abstract because it's all over the place, right? You got individual dudes flying around in spaceships doing missions, and then you got Death Stars coming in and eradicating planets at the same time. So it's like, what is the scale? It's kind of everywhere.
Well, what about Space Empires 4X then?
Strategic, but the scale is implied to be ships, right? The counters, except with the exception of the merchant caravan or whatever they're called, counters, the merchant pipeline counters.
Okay.
The unit scale is assumed to be ships, and I mean, you can call that abstract if you want, but I think if you start saying that's not abstract, that is abstract, and they actually represent groups of ships, then you start talking about, okay, well, what happens when I upgrade these, not these, and it gets weird. So I would just say it's ship scale, right? Whatever that is, which kind of implies that it's tactical, but you're also keeping track of economy and spending points to do things, which suggests that it's strategic, right? So beyond that, how those words correlate to unit scale depends on the topic, right? And I've mentioned this before as well. You can have a game like Pat Mullen's A Hot Dry Season, which is a Vietnam operational game, but at the unit scale is companies. Normally, in like a World War II game, company scale would be a tactical scale. Squad, platoon, company, generally tactical scale. Companies at the upper end. When you get into battalion, then you're looking at more operational. Companies are kind of on the border. You start looking at divisions, corps, and armies. Then you start edging, and then we're talking about World War II, right? And these numbers might, for one thing, if you're talking about like an ancient Roman game, none of these words mean anything, right? You either got legions or war bands of various sizes or phalanxes, or those are the units. But generally speaking, when we're talking about ancient games, what we see is either the game is tactical, where the individual units can represent, this is a cohort of Roman, troops from such and such a legion, and then this is a Greek phalanx, or you end up with some kind of strength point mechanism, as you would see in something like a Pax Romana or an Imperium Romanum or something like that. Now, Imperium Romanum I would consider operational, but it's another one of those games that is somewhat strategic in that you're keeping track of a lot of economy at the same time. So it depends on the scale. For like tactical, like I think for a lot of people, tactical Napoleonic represents battalions. For the same people, tactical Civil War is regiments. So,
it seems to be a contradiction when you say tactical Civil War or tactical Napoleonic.
Well, they mean different things, right? It depends on what kind of engagements you're talking about. If you're talking about, say you have, couldn't name a game that does this offhand, but let's say you're talking about a game about engagements in Afghanistan or in the war on terror, or war on terror or whatever. You're probably talking about pretty small engagements. Right. You're talking about squads or platoons or maybe companies against, equivalent numbers on the other side. Whereas, you say tactical Civil War, well, that's just the size of the battles that that we see games on anyway. There are certainly some smaller things that happened in the Civil War, and even some of the relatively well-known battles are not that huge. But you start talking about Gettysburg, and if you dip below the regimental scale, you start looking at games that you can't manage anymore. A regimental scale Gettysburg game is a huge game. So,
isn't that what Flying Pig Games is coming out with?
That's a bit of a hybrid scale, actually. That's kind of like a demi-brigade scale is what I'd call it. I'm not sure that's what Herman calls it. That's a Most Fearful Sacrifice. It's based on Herman's blind sword system, which up to this point, for American Civil War at least, has always been regimental scale. The games in question are Thunder in the Ozarks, which is Pea Ridge, Longstreet Attacks, which is the second day at Gettysburg, and The Devils to Pay, which is the first day at Gettysburg. Those are the ones that I'm aware of. Those are all regimental scale, right? The units are regiments. Each counter represents a regiment of troops. A Most Fearful Sacrifice, which is the new one, it's two maps, but they're really quite large maps, right? I'd say it's almost the same size as something in terms of map footprint as something like a Terrible Swift Sword, which is a regimental level game. But in order to keep the number of counters reasonable and the game playable in a relatively shorter amount of time, Herman has made the call to say, we're gonna, this particular counter represents this really big regiment, or this other counter represents these two regiments, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of that's why I say like a demi-brigade. So the units are like half brigade scales on average. I think that's correct.
The blind sword system, isn't it basically a chit pull thing?
It is, yeah. Except that the chits, and this is another interesting thing about a Most Fearful Sacrifice. You draw these chits, right? And some of the chits are activation chits, and then some of these chits are like special action chits. And you kind of draw the chits, and you got a special action chit. You don't have to play it right away. You can kind of reserve it and play it when you want to play it, which kind of makes it that you have a hand of chits. Most Fearful Sacrifice just uses cards for that. I think it's a better sort of tactilely superior solution to use cards for that. But it's a big enough game that you could support that. It would be hard to do something like it would hard to do cards in like a Thunder in the Ozarks because you'd only have like 15 cards, right? Nobody has card games with 15 cards.
You're not getting that game, eh?
Oh, Most Fearful Sacrifice? No, I expect to have that.
Well, you didn't kickstart it?
I did not get on the Kickstarter. No, the timing was not optimal for me. So
I don't know why. I think you're never going to get it if you didn't kickstart it.
So, I don't know about that. I don't think they're going to be stupid enough to only print the number of games that they sold through the Kickstarter. Plus, remember, a lot of companies have like post Kickstarter backing now too. So I don't know if that's the case here, but you can a lot of times get in on the Kickstarters after the fact too. I've never thought of these as a family of games, particularly when we add Star Soldier to the mix. Hetzer, wow.
I've never seen that game, Hetzer.
I have. It's a Spitzer game. If SPI published it, I've never seen an SPI version, but I can picture the box of the Spitzer version in my head. So are we saying that this makes sense? I haven't actually seen The Devils to Pay. I think this is one brigade is represented by two counters. Yeah, I believe that sounds like what Herman did with the Most Fearful Sacrifice, actually. And The Devils to Pay is like a mini box game, so it actually makes sense to do that. But I can tell you, because I have played Longstreet Attacks and Thunder in the Ozarks, and those are where the units are regiments. So
I thought you weren't a big Civil War buff.
What? Who are you talking about?
Okay, somebody else.
Clearly not me. I'm a huge. I mean, I'm missed. Yeah, no,
Sorry.
that ain't me. So you're thinking of Stigler, but who's also a huge Civil War guy. So this is an interesting thing, actually. In what scales does things like unit facing become important? Generally, you're talking about tactical games, if that's the case. But like Blind Swords does not one of the refreshing things about Blind Swords for me was that you didn't have to worry about unit facing, because that can represent like that can create tactility problems with knocking over stacks and things like that. So if you have to keep track of the facing of individual units, the devil's to pay.
Who said that? Who was the guy who coined that?
The devil's to pay? That was the Buford, General Buford, on the first day at Gettysburg. It's in the movie. You've seen the movie, right?
I didn't finish watching it.
Well, it's like the first third of the movie, so you don't see Sam Elliott after that.
Yeah, I don't know what. There's something about that movie that pisses me off.
It's the facial hair. The only person in there with real facial hair is Sam Elliott.
Yeah, because General Lee? There's a guy there with
the fake facial hair on Martin Sheen is pretty good.
Martin Sheen,
like the Longstreet, that's not entirely convincing. Although the historical Longstreet did have a ridiculous looking beard. But there's a lot of fake facial hair in the movie, and mostly it's not very good.
It's too clean.
It's not that it's too clean. It looks like it's held down with spirit gum.
That's the thing with that movie. It's too clean.
So, well, some of those. The other thing with that is that the soldiers are pretty much all Civil War reenactors. They had a huge number of Civil War reenactors to make the movie, and let's say that those reenactors are generally a little better fed than the historical Confederate troops were. So. And that's the thing. Armistead's did look okay, but Armistead's gets a lot of screen time too. So, as did Martin Sheen. So that was Richard Jordan's last movie, by the way. He was dying of brain cancer even as they were filming that thing. So, yeah, I agree with this. The gamers counters, I think, do not reflect this particularly well. The Civil War, the Great Battles of the American Civil War counters are, I think, easier to deal with in general, and I think they are easier to see which way they're facing. I think a little easier.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Frederick the Great is a game with strength points. Be interesting to know what the first game with strength points was, rather than trying to attach actual size labels to the units. And I also wonder who the designer of Frederick the Great was.
I have the box right here.
Edward Curran and Frank Davis.
Don't make me get up then. You know what I'm saying?
I got it on BGG right here. Didn't know that. That's a well-regarded game, by the way.
Yeah, Carl Paradzi gave it to me. Only the box.
What, an empty box?
Yeah.
Well, that's nice of him. You gonna put a different game in the box?
No.
So you're saying you want me to send you a copy of Frederick the Great? Is what without the box is what you're saying? Because I think I have one. I think I've got one in the SPI flat, actually.
Hey, man.
So it's still a well-regarded game. Frank Davis, pulling him up. A whole bunch of interesting things, including really also credited on the Guns of August. So I don't want to go with what BGG says here, because I think Rob Bama was the designer of Guns of August and maybe Frank Davis was the developer, and they don't just differentiate that on BGG. So that's a thing. This here says he was one of the people in the pipeline for the Decision Games Leipzig game, which I actually have. And then there's Red Sun Rising, which is a SPI game. So it looks like he was active in the SPI era and not more recently. That's my guess. I don't know anything about Frank Davis other than that. And Edward Curran gets a credit on War in the Pacific, the SPI War in the Pacific, actually, and Cemetery Hill, which is one of the blue and gray quad games from SPI. I feel like I've missed a post here.
I don't know. Stigler's arguing.
This is actually a good. Kyle Reese is actually asking me a really good question. Is asking a really good question here. At what scale are engineer units best represented, since they are usually attachments to larger formations? In many cases, this is true. It depends on the scale, though. Let's say so. OCS famously, Dean made the decision with OCS to basically not have engineer units and to say that engineer units are units that are attached to cores, which are the HQs. So the engineering functions are performed by HQs in OCS. In contrast, and I think the OCS rule is an answer to this, Europa has shit tons of tiny engineer battalions.
Do they have medics too?
Not to my knowledge. No, I don't think so.
So how realistic is that?
Well, so it depends on the topic, though. I mean, in something like, in generally speaking, engineers weren't, fighting as like there's engineer divisions, right? I mean, Kyle's right in that these are generally units that are attached to some, not necessarily larger formation, but some other unit. But in a game like a D-Day game, I think there's a lot of value in having individual engineer units. Now, in say the Gauss D-Day game, and actually the other Gauss games too, but they're most useful in the D-Day game for reasons that should be relatively obvious. You have engineer battalions, but you're generally not going to use them as battalions. You're generally going to break them down into companies and then spread the companies around to accompany infantry assaulting dug-in enemy troops, for example, or bridging rivers or things like that.
Well, who's going to use the Bangalore torpedoes? Engineers, right?
Well, those are only used in the landings, though. And I don't think they didn't give those to engineers. They gave the regular troops had those.
What's a Bangalore torpedo?
It's kind of like a bomb on a big, long stick.
Right, okay, that's what I thought.
So why they called them that, I looked up at some point why they called them that, but I'm not sure.
Must have been a guy called like Frank Bangalore or something.
I remember. That's possible, yeah. I don't think they were invented in Bangalore. Facing does not have anything to do with stacking. Let's try and figure out what Stigler's off on here. Soldiers in those movies are really... Oh, he's totally right about this.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's easier to handle counters if there's no stacking. I think that's all Jeff's getting at here. And he's right, of course, but this is why we have tweezers too, right? This is why I have, we're handy right here.
Yeah, but what happens if you're on meds and your hands are shaking a bit?
Well, then you better come up with a different solution, or I guess you don't play these kind of games. To be honest about it, I mean, and that's a thing that can happen. Yeah, I've seen people, hold the tweezers like this, where you got both elbows on the table and you do this. I mean, I've seen that. Yeah, or you're generally resting your elbow on the table too. I can't just like reach over like this all the time. I've become exhausted very quickly doing that. So Jeff is saying that Bangalore torpedoes were invented in Bangalore, India. I don't think so, but I don't know. I remember looking this up at one point, and I don't remember what the actual answer was. Yeah, so this is in Europa. The objection to this in Europa was that these engineer units were often like thrown into the line because you needed somebody in the line, right? And historically those units would not have been used that way. But the problem isn't that there are engineers as such. The problem is that there aren't rules for things for the engineers to do that are engineer things that are, you don't work where you don't want to throw them into the line because they're too valuable. Like if you have to cross rivers that you have to build pontoon bridges or build fortifications or take fortifications apart. In Goss, for example, there's some kinds of fortifications that you have to have engineers to build. And the more engineers you have working on them, the faster you build them.
Panzer Leader has engineers.
Okay. I've never played Panzer Leader. So, but Panzer Leader's a pretty low-level game, too. I mean, Squad Leader, SL has engineers. I mean, sometimes those units those squads will be engineer squads. So,
man, if
this is true too, and I think offhand in both Great Battles of the American Civil War and in Line of Battle, there's a mechanism for moving troops in column where you don't care as much or in the same way as you do if they are in the front line. But of course, you don't want to get them caught in combat when they're in column either.
1912.
Okay, so apparently they were invented in Bangalore, India. So, which makes sense. So there you go. There's your answer. News you can use. So, I mean, I suspect most people know about them from being used on D-Day. So this depends. Okay, so Doug's saying that facing is only important for the fighting front line, which I sort of agree with. But that's why I said most of these games where that's important have some kind of mechanism for ignoring facing, or more or less.
But Stigler has a rebuttal.
Yes. If your scale is such as you have multiple units per area, then I think you're running into scale mismatch problems. That I don't necessarily agree with, but potentially that's true. So the stacking limit in, say, Great Battles of the American Civil War is, I think, 15 strength points of infantry. And that's depending on the exact units we're talking about. That's generally 2 smallish regiments. It's not really a problem, but you can have. There is a rule in Great Battles that all units in the hex have to be facing the same direction, and you have to have a unit like if you have stacking in a game like that, then you have to have that rule. Otherwise, it's going to be a total disaster. And I think Line of Battle has a similar rule as well. Jeff asks how many war games are designed to be played with tweezers. I'd say
less.
Yes, I can't argue with that, but certainly there are more tweezer. I mean, there's still plenty of tweezer games coming out every year. A lot of MMP's output are what I would call tweezer games, for example. A decent amount of stuff comes out from GMT is games that I'd play with tweezers. Like Gallipoli 19. So just stuff that I've picked out. Atlantic Chase. Yeah, I don't need tweezers for that.
No.
But Gallipoli 1915. Yeah, I'd be using tweezers for that. That's not that old. Pacific War. I mean, looking at Mark Herman's been doing videos on his new version of Pacific War, by the way, which everybody I hope has watched already. I would totally use tweezers with that. But the other thing that you can't really see in Mark's videos is that you can, but it's not necessarily that obvious. You're going to keep a lot of units off map on displays that they move in force markers around on the maps. So Stigler has been compared to General McClellan. Them's literally fighting words.
Talking about McClellan, there's a tobacco that went out of business by McClellan.
By McClellan's?
1 tin of 50 grams, $200 US.
That better be good.
It's not $200 good.
Yeah, I bet not. That seems like a crazy amount of money. Of course, it could be like Port Ellen, too. Port Ellen was a distillery on the Isle of Isla that shuttered many years ago. And Scotch that came from that distillery is worth a fortune nowadays because they haven't made it in 40 years or something like that.
Yeah, but is it a good Scotch? Well,
I don't know. Probably, but yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't know. I'll never taste it. A lot of what is around is like sitting in a warehouse and gets blended into other things.
So what a shame.
A little bit, yeah. I think that's true. Is it ungentlemanly to engineer unit snipe? No, I wouldn't say it's ungentlemanly. I mean, you know, war's war, you know.
God blast them out of the skies.
Now, there's the Godzilla rule in OCS to prevent against that kind of misbehavior of fast-moving units running around in the backfield. That's a thing that annoyed Dean at one point.
What, is he saying that you can't snipe an engineer unit?
He's asking if it's ungentlemanly to do so. I don't know that he's suggesting necessarily that you can't or shouldn't.
Why wouldn't you want to snipe an engineer? He's going to blow up your bridge.
This is totally a thing that happens. Is recon via barrage. That is totally a thing that I've seen in some games. Here's another one. The new Battle for Normandy from GMT that's coming at some point. That'll require tweezers. Blended Scotch. I have a tendency towards snobbery, as you may have noticed. And I have no problem with blended Scotch at all. I'd rather drink single malt because I think it's more interesting, but that does not mean it's better. It just means you're getting to taste what that distillery produces rather than something that's been blended to be agreeable.
Yeah, no, look, blended Scotches.
Well-blended Scotches are very agreeable. I got a bottle of
amazing
Johnny Walker Double Black over here. That's just fantastic. And I'm amazed that I still have the bottle actually. So I don't know that I've really thought of it in this way, but I suppose I've got large and clumsy fingers. So I would really rather use tweezers for the most part. Sometimes I'll even use tweezers for games that you really don't necessarily need tweezers on. Games like Paths of Glory, for example. I've used tweezers in Paths of Glory, and you don't need to, unless you have giant, sausage fingers.
Artie, when you're playing a monster game and you're using tweezers and your nose is itchy, do you scratch your nose with the tweezers?
I probably wouldn't. But
no.
That's a very expensive way to do that.
Hey, come on.
So now I would absolutely edit this out on video if I did that, but it happens all the time. I mean, I was using tweezers just to put counters in a tray exactly right the other day, and I was dropping stacks all the time. It happens. It helps if the counters are all the same size, and that is a problem with the die cutting process for certain games and certain manufacturers. Older games that tended to happen a lot with. Many Avalon Hill games had counters with, some counters were wider than other counters. I've got some SPI games that are like that. I've even got 2 games from GMT that are like that. So that are like last couple of years games too.
A stupid question here, Artie. Not that any of my questions are intelligent, but do you use pointy tweezers or flat tweezers?
My tweezers are all pointy. Except these. So these are the ones from Amazon. These are the pointy tweezers. But I also have these tweezers, which are sort of custom made. So these are like regular tweezers, and they have rounded tips. And somebody made that we know, and John Madison knows as well, made a special die to bend the tips.
Bloody
so they're
hell.
Exactly right like this. And I'll tell you what, I've got some friends that have these where you like close them and the tips are too far apart, and I don't like those. This pair are wonderful. I love these.
So how do you pick it up?
From the top.
Okay.
Yeah, from the top. In this case, now for something like this, you're kind of coming in to some extent from the side. But because of that, I find it easier to drop counters using these tweezers than I do these tweezers. And that's why, because the whole stack remains upright with these tweezers, because you're kind of going in from the top, picking it up straight up and moving it, as opposed to going in from the side, picking it up and kind of arcing it out. You know what I'm saying?
God,
if that makes any sense. Clearly, I need to do a video on tweezers.
Seriously?
So, yeah, John, I'm hoping that we'll get more of those. So, because I'd take another couple of pairs personally. because those are the only ones that I have. They're the only ones that I like that. So, I mean, Stigler, it doesn't matter if you know the rules or not if you can't handle the counters.
Okay.
How many tweezers do I have? I have about 8 pairs of tweezers, give or take one or two. I've got about 8 pairs.
Do you got more tweezers than you have bottles of scotch?
No.
Okay.
No, I have more than 8 bottles of scotch at the moment.
That's good.
But I have a lot of tweezers too. Now, like 4 of those are identical pairs of tweezers that I bought, I think from the gamers back in the day at an Origins or something like that. I'm like, yeah, I'll take 4 of those, sure. And those, do I have one of those here? I might. Yes, those are these tweezers. Now you can get these on Amazon as well. These are just surgical tweezers with bent tips. And I find that on this particular model, there's a couple things. I tend to bend them, spread them out a little bit because they're a little narrow. There's also this little spike here.
What is that?
Intended to keep the tweezers aligned properly.
Oh,
I constantly stab myself on that thing, so I take a file and file the point off. So,
God.
So yeah, I got plenty of tweezers. There's no tweezer shortage here. So, I might do that actually. And there's a couple of, there's a bunch of different kinds. Some people I've seen those giant barbecue tweezers that somebody, I forget whether it's Wardrobe or somebody like that, has these 2-foot long tweezers that I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure where you get them. I'm not sure how they're useful, but they're enormous. They're like the kind of tweezers you would use on the barbecue grill to flip steaks over. So, and there are kitchen tweezers too. There are culinary tweezers that chefs use. So that's a thing. I have done this month. Come on. I have done this too, but you don't want to go too heavy on that because it can tend to that stuff's really thick and viscous and can create this really thick layer on the counters on the tips of the tweezers that you might need to work around. So clearly we need to have an episode on tweezers,
I guess.
So this week's we got a couple minutes left here. Next week's counter clipping show will have a special guest. We're going to be talking about the worldwide shipping problems and how they are affecting the wargaming industry.
Wow, I'm curious.
Very interesting. Yep. I will do absolutely no preparatory work and will rely entirely on my special guest to provide us with data that we can talk about. So, okay. I still have my wisdom teeth, actually.
No.
And they really haven't started to bother me until about the last month.
Yeah, well, it's going to hurt, man.
I'd prefer to keep them if at all possible.
No, I don't think so.
Well, it's the gums around them that actually hurt, not the teeth. But
I had 4 wisdom teeth taken out at one time. Trust me, and I had what you call dry socket. God, did that hurt?
That sounds uncomfortable. It's better than dry glass of scotch.
Yeah,
that's that's more like it. I will accept this honor. NHS Blue Tweezer, says Alan. Yeah, actually, so this is a British thing, I guess. Alan, the Blue Tweezers from the Blue Tweezers channel uses those blue plastic tweezers. I don't know where to get those here in the U.S., but it might be that if you're in England, you can get them through the NHS, which is their national, socialist healthcare that they have because they're commies. So I guess you could do this too. I don't know if they're the right size tweezers or not, but so this fancy pair of tweezers, the fancy one, where are they? The fancy pair of tweezers that I bought on Amazon not that long ago that came with the flashlight, these were only like $9. So it's not like they're really expensive.
Have you ever used a flashlight?
No. The first thing I did when I took them out of the bubble wrap was to get rid of the flashlight. I'm going to take the position that I got bad eyes. I'm going to take the position that if I got to worry about whether my tweezers have a flashlight on them, that we need more light in the room.
Hey, Stigler, what's wrong with socialist tweezers?
They're socialist. They're commie tweezers. They got little engravings of Stalin on the tweezers. So
we're a socialist country. We got no Stalin tweezers, man.
I'm just saying, capitalist tweezers. Yeah, only if they come with like an insulin pen. If is the only way that works. We got pictures of Adam Smith on the insulin pens that cost $300 a dose.
It doesn't cost us $300 already, man.
I am aware of that.
You know, come here. I'll jab you with a.
Yeah, but I can get war games here in Ohio. I'd have to have my war games all shipped to me in gold-plated packaging if I lived in another country.
You know what I'm saying?
So there's that. So what I got to do here is buy all the war games now while I'm living in Ohio, and then when I get sick, I'll go to Canada.
That's right, man.
That's how we'll do it.
I'll trade your war game for an insulin shot.
Old and busted. All right, we are out of time. I would like to thank everybody for watching. Dan, do you have anything coming up before Saturday's news show?
No, but I want to say thanks, Artie, for putting up with my stupid questions.
Oh, no problem at all. We have 46 people watching right now. I think it's been a little higher than that, but I could be wrong. But we will see everybody next week. We will have a fascinating topic that we haven't determined yet. We will determine it 30 to 40 seconds before the show, as usual. And we will be on Dan's channel next week. So tune in then. Until then, everybody have a great night.
Thanks, man.